willing to be able to see it and imagine it and take that step.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's really why I took the time to try to write the book, try to get out there to spread to convey this information, is that there's a fear that if we take stands that are too strong, then we're going to lose elections and alienate voters and turn people off. And whereas what I've been trying to document in terms of leaning, lots of data, I've got data scientists, experts, and PhDs, supporting my the number running and whatnot, that there is a majority support for that kind of political approach and that kind of aggressive approach. And if we were to do it also with laying out the values and the vision behind it, we really should be able to do all of these different types of things. But
we should be able to do these.
Right. I think, Raymond, though, that we have the numbers, but right. The people at the top levels of democratic and progressive politics don't believe that. And they believe that will alienate people and will turn people right. off by being too strong. But that is not actually what any of the data lays itself out. And then going back to what we were actually talking about at the top about how the history of the inequality within our society makes people of color inherently progressive because they want to get towards equality. Yeah. And that sector of the population is growing and growing and growing. It was 12% of the population in the 1960s, 41% today. And so going in that direction, and then what's completely underappreciated is that there is what I call a meaningful minority of whites who want this to be a multiracial progressive country. And so together, that is the coalition which can bring about transformation within the country, but also, I would argue, has an appetite for much larger and more consequential policy proposals and changes.
Let me ask you a question, because there is so much focus, and I think rightly so, on what Trump is doing, what the MAGA movement is doing, and the Republicans are doing, because it poses, I think, a very real threat to our democracy, such as it is. But I think what is lost in that is how much resistance there is within the Democratic Party as an institution to making fundamental changes that will result in things like true racial justice, Medicare for all, sweeping changes of that sort. There is a really big resistance to that institutionally within the Democratic Party, which is supposedly the vehicle for progressive change in the United States of America. Why do you think it is that there is so much resistance to it there? Is it too strongly tied to its own questionable history? Is it too controlled by corporate forces who want a specific set of results from it? Or is there just a mindset that sort of thing cannot be done? And if any of those things or all of those things are true, what can we do? How can we form a coalition in order to overcome that resistance? Because as it stands, it seems to me that the Democratic Party, if we rely upon it solely, is never going to get that job done.
Well, it's absolutely a mindset issue, and it's also somewhat a generational issue. And so in my first book, Brown is the New White, I have a chapter titled "Fewer Smart-Ass White Boys." Right. And that's a line from Andrew Young, was Dr. King's lieutenant, and then the mayor of Atlanta. Right. And in '84, he was working with Walter Mondale, the Democratic nominee, trying to get him to be more progressive, to invest in mobilizing voters of color. And he said famously, he says, "I'm trying to get them to listen, but it's a bunch of smart ass white boys, and you can't tell them anything." And so I think it's a good distillation that the mindset of those who are in charge of really controlling democratic strategy and spending is far too narrow and far too anachronistic. And then if you look at someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has a much bolder vision and is quite articulate in laying it out, and has millions of people. She's one of the largest, Instagram and Twitter followers that are out there. So the appetite is there. So I look at it like, Biden's history he's been far more moderate. That's been his DNA, et cetera. I think he's been a far more progressive president as a practical matter than people realize. So I've been quite, overall pleasantly surprised. But we have to have these struggles and have to fight it out. I look at it as we're in an existential battle in 2024. We have to stave off like literal fascism and the end of democracy, the restoration of white supremacy. Biden's our best vehicle. Let's ride with Biden in 2024. But then we have to have, which really should be a 4-year debate on the progressive side and with the Democratic Party around these exact issues. What should the policy? And then lost to the conventional wisdom. I mean, Bernie Sanders was very strong in elections in terms of the level of support that he had. And his label is socialist. Yeah. And so clearly there's a larger appetite for more progressive politics than the people at the tip top of the party appreciate. But that's the struggle I think should take place starting in November, but not before November.
Yeah, no, I definitely see the battle being, in the long term, being within the Democratic Party as opposed to, outside of that, because in a way, I don't want to minimize it because, as you've said and as I've said, Republicans and Trump really do pose a serious, dangerous threat to our country, especially in this election. But in the long term, it does have to be worked out between the forces of power and stasis in the Democratic Party and these new forces that are emerging. I almost hesitate to say that. They've always been there, but they're coalescing in a way that almost hasn't been permissible, say prior to 10 years ago. I can't imagine people seriously talking about Bernie Sanders, a socialist, as being a presidential candidate prior to about 2014. I mean, and can you imagine that happening in the 80s or even the 90s, when we were in the Cold War? I think America is still recovering from like a bad bout of Cold War propaganda that we haven't shaken ourselves from, and as we progress and continue from that, maybe the hope gets better. But you're right, we do have to overcome this challenge because if that happens, I don't really know what will happen to this country, and I don't know what. I mean, there will be a very decisive victory, again for those forces that supposedly lost the Civil War back in the day, and they're going to be much more entrenched and much more difficult to get rid of than they were 4 years ago. So, yeah, absolutely. I see what you see. We've been speaking with Steve Phillips. He is the author of How We Win the Civil War, Securing a Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good. Thank you so much for what you've written. Tell us where people can find your podcast and other places where you expound on the good things that you do.
So you can both follow me at stevephillips.com, that's where my website is, and then also democracyincolor.com is where the podcast is, and people can sign up. We have a weekly newsletter that goes out there as well. So those are the two places to follow me.
Fantastic. Steve Phillips, thanks again so much, and thank you for being with us today on Facepalm America.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being with us today on Facepalm America. Facepalm America is a production of Two Squared Media Productions. You can go to Two Squared Media Productions, all one word, for more information. I want to thank Ace Elson and Rosabelle Hine, who are the producers of this show. And I want to ask you to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps grow our audience. And until next time, enjoy the day.